In the late 18th and 19th centuries, we start to see a time period which really changes the life of a lot of people called the Industrial Revolution. So when we say what is the Industrial Revolution, we are talking primarily about a time period in which there is a shift from living on farms to living in city areas. Okay? And as a straight definition of the Industrial Revolution, it is the time period when goods start to be made by machines rather than people. So what we see is a large output of what eventually we're going to call consumer goods. Where does this take place? It takes place first in England, and there are four major reasons why England kind of moves ahead of everybody else. England had, at the time, it had a very high population. So England had a high population, it had many people, it had, in addition to that, it had rivers. While that doesn't seem like a big deal to us today, England had both rivers and it had harbors. Fast-moving rivers are extremely important for industrialization. In fact, if you look at the United States, it is the northern part of the United States that hosts most of the cities. And that is because the rivers in the northern part of the United States move considerably faster than the rivers in the southern part of the United States. The third thing that England had, which gave it a very big advantage, was it had quite a bit of coal. Coal is a natural resource which, along with water, began to power both transportation systems and factories. And finally, England had iron. It had large deposits of iron. Iron could be turned, as we're going to talk about later, could be turned to steel. And so steel became kind of the bedrock, or kind of the basic metal that is used in making factories, which was very important in this Industrial Revolution. So we know it started in England. It is eventually going to go from England to the rest of Europe. So it's going to go to countries like Germany, like Belgium, like France, Spain, Italy. And it will eventually then go across the ocean to the United States. It's actually snuck out of England. The plans for a factory are actually snuck out of England by a man named Samuel Slater. So if you look at what I just said, England, the rest of Europe, and the United States, we are actually talking today, 150 years later, about some of the wealthiest countries in the world. So we know one of the major things that happens when a country has an industrial revolution is that great amounts of money and wealth are brought to that country. So let's talk about what happens when in England people start shifting from the countryside into the cities to work in factories. If we come up here and divide up England into a bunch of little fields, we have England divided as little individual farms. So this would be farm number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And these were primarily poor English farmers that lived side by side for centuries. Most of these people had their land passed down to them from their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers and so on. What started to happen, if you come down here, what started to happen was there was something that took place called the enclosure movement. And what happened with this enclosure movement is wealthy people would come in from the outside and they would actually buy up big areas of land from this farmer and this farmer, this farmer, this farmer, and they would actually do what to it? They would enclose the land. So they might buy 5, 6, 7, 8 farms right next to each other and enclose the farms and make a giant mega farm. As a result, these big, really industrialists or wealthy people from the outside drove small farmers off of their farms, and those farmers started moving to cities to work in factories along with their families and their children. And on these farms, they started experimenting with all kinds of new methods, such as seed drills, such as rotating crops, rotating the actual farmland so that the farms became incredibly productive. And the farms actually became huge businesses themselves. But they did not benefit the little guy in society or the regular farmers who, like I said, took off and went to cities. So that whole movement is called the enclosure movement. One of the things that happens during this time period is we have a technological advancement in a number of important areas. The first is a guy named James Hargreaves. James Hargreaves comes along and he introduces to the world something called the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny was actually a machine that made fabric. Okay, and when we talk about fabric, we are talking really about a bigger term, which is textiles. He made it possible to make textiles very quickly. If you actually look closely at any piece of clothing that you have, you will notice that they're made of a bunch of little threads. Okay? It used to take somebody hours and hours and hours to weave these threads together. Well, James Hargreaves actually makes a machine that he calls the spinning jenny, and this spinning jenny comes along and can make quite a bit of cloth in a very short period of time. That was actually put into factories, and a lot of these factories were powered at first, like we said before, by water. And eventually what happens is they are powered by an invention that is not originally invented, but is improved upon by a guy named James Watt, and that is a steam engine. For our practical purposes, you can just remember that James Watt invented the steam engine. And what the steam engine does essentially is it is a huge vat that is actually filled with water. A fire is made down below that vat, and what happens is there are valves here and here, and when water is heated up inside here, it will actually look for a way to escape, and it will make this vat spin very quickly, and as a result, as the thing spins, it generates power. Brilliant invention. They take this steam engine invented by James Watt and they do things with it like put it onto a locomotive, and they have now made the first steam engine. They also take it and put it onto a boat, and they've made, of course, a steamboat. So in addition to factories, the steam engine also moves ahead the area of transportation very quickly. Our third inventor is a guy by the name of Eli Whitney. You have probably heard about him because his invention is incredibly famous. In 1794, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. The cotton gin, this stands for engine. The cotton engine is actually a very basic invention. Cotton looks much like this when it grows on the stalk. It is a plant that has a bunch of thorns at the top and a puff of cotton. In nature, what happens is this cotton puff is filled with seeds, and the wind comes along and blows it, and it actually takes off and obviously makes new cotton plants. What people used to do is they would go into the field and they would actually pick the cotton out this way, and they'd have to be very careful to reach in between the thorns, and they would pick it, but then they had the problem of a cotton ball that was filled with seeds. What the cotton engine did was it was actually a machine with a big handle on it, and you would turn the crank and it would rip all of the seeds out of the cotton. The machine that he did made it possible for one person to sit in a barn and turn that handle and do the work of 50 workers, which meant that the demand for cotton worldwide went up incredibly, along with this spinning jenny, which could then spin the cotton into threads very quickly, which could then make it into textiles and shirts and clothing and drapes and that kind of thing. And so what happens is Eli Whitney accidentally raises the demand for slaves worldwide, which eventually is going to lead to the American Civil War, among many other atrocities. Henry Bessemer is going to be the last one. He is going to come along and he is going to invent, in terms of technology, he is going to invent a way to turn iron into steel. Steel is actually a brilliant metal, largely because of the fact that it bends. It is extremely strong and it bends. If you have ever been on a bridge that looks like this is called an extension bridge. They're found all around major cities. Steel makes it possible to make an incredibly large bridge like this. Those bridges are actually hanging on steel cables, and if you notice sometimes you go across those bridges, and if there's a lot of weight on the bridge will actually bounce. That is the steel giving. In addition to these extension bridges, you also have in major cities things like skyscrapers, which are possible for the first time because of steel. Okay? In addition to that, you have things like railroads, elevators, All of these things are made possible because of steel. When Henry Bessemer comes along, the process of turning iron into steel cost about $100 a ton. 12 years later, the price had dropped to about $15. $15 for a ton of steel, which made it widely available and really launched the building of more factories, more transportation systems, all of these things that kind of fueled the Industrial Revolution.